So in the last class, we looked at the British Empire, how Britain controlled almost a third of the planet's land and populations, and how the British Empire was about trying to maximize profits for Britain, exploiting people through first slavery and other forms of exploitation, taking the resources from Africa and Asia and the Caribbean, enriching Britain. But controlling and exploiting these massive populations required policing. And it wasn't just a violent form of policing as people challenged British power and fought for their freedom, but it was also a racist form of policing, a forms of policing which wouldn't be used necessarily against the British population. And forms of policing which were so violent that they came to mark Britain as not only a nation which became powerful through exploitation and through slavery and through the expanse of its power, but also a nation which maintained that empire through extreme forms of violence and policing. And we looked at 3 or 4 key ways in which that form of policing came into being. The identification of a suspect community. In the case of Kenya, it was the Kikuyu. The surveillance of that suspect community through checkpoints and searches and containment. And then we looked at the way in which that suspect community was collectively punished. So even if 1 or 2 people in that community were found guilty of a crime, everyone in that community would be punished through mass imprisonment or deportation. And we also looked at how that collective punishment used extreme forms of violence, poison gas, guns, and at times even torture and forced labour. But what's that all got to do with Britain today? How has that history of empire in the 1950s and 60s and the decades and centuries before it come to affect life here on the British mainland in the 20th and 21st centuries? So after World War II, Britain had been destroyed. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Britain's major cities were bombed during World War II. And Britain wanted a new, fresh start after the war. It wanted to set up a national health service. It wanted to set up a massive public transportation system. It wanted to set up new housing for people and develop jobs. But because so many people had died in the war and so much had been destroyed, it needed new workforces. It needed new workers. And so it invited people from its colonies in the Caribbean and Asia and Africa to come to Britain, come to the center of empire to help rebuild it. And come they did. Thousands of people from the Caribbean, from Asia and from Africa migrated to Britain on Britain's invitation in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s to help rebuild the center of empire, to help rebuild Britain after it was destroyed in World War II, and importantly, help to build a new Britain, help to build Britain's National Health Service, the NHS, helped build Britain's public transportation system, the tube system, the buses that you see in London, and the massive train networks across the country, helped to build Britain's council housing, and the housing that we see today, as well as much of the other infrastructure. But the other thing that migrated to Britain at the same time in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s weren't just the people from Britain's colonies in the Caribbean, in Africa, and Asia. The other thing that migrated to Britain were the colonial ideas which were used to police those communities, the racist ideas that were used to police those communities. And so while racist ideas were used to police and control Britain's colonized populations, as we saw in the last class, in colonial Kenya, which enabled them to use violence and collective punishments and surveillance against them. But those ideas began to migrate to Britain and began to be used on the British mainland to police these what were called coloured populations at the time, people from Africa and Asia and the Caribbean. And one example of this really arose in the 1970s, and it was the idea of mugging. You're probably all familiar with the term mugging, right? So a street robbery. And what arose in Britain in the 1970s was the idea that there was an epidemic of mugging, a massive increase and a massive problem with mugging. And according to the British police and the British government, as well as a lot of the media, this problem of mugging arose from black people. Now, despite the fact that robbery has existed in Britain for hundreds of years, it's always existed in Britain, particularly in its major cities. In the 1970s and early 80s, the press and the politicians and the police created the impression that this was a new problem. And they did it in a really interesting way. So mugging, if someone mugs you, that's not actually a crime. There's nothing on the law books, the legal books, which has the word mugging on. Mugging is a category of crime. What does that mean, a category of crime? So a category of crime isn't a crime in and itself. A category of crime is a collection of different crimes, right? So mugging, if you think about mugging as a category of crime, that could include robbery, theft, like assault, like maybe someone might punch you and steal your phone or your wallet. Obviously, people didn't really have mobile phones in the 1970s, but they might steal your purse, for instance, if you're a woman. And so all of these different crimes, theft, robbery, assault, get kind of vacuumed up into this new category of crime. And so it creates the impression that there is a new problem, that there is a different problem. And if there's a new problem and a different problem, it can be attributed, it can be blamed on new and different people. And the new and different people to which mugging was blamed were the young black people of Britain, particularly in its inner city areas. And so, because there was apparently a new and different problem arising in Britain, mugging, it required a new and different type of policing. And that type of policing had echoes of colonial policing. So the first thing that we see Britain doing is identifying a suspect community. You probably remember from the last class, the suspect community in colonial Kenya that we learnt about were the Kikuyu people. Well, in Britain, the suspect community being identified was the black population of Britain. The second thing they did was impose forms of surveillance. Now, they didn't have the kind of checkpoints that were set up in colonial Kenya and other colonies of Britain. But what they did do was impose a new set of laws called the sus laws. So the sus laws were laws of suspicion. So sus is short for suspicion. And it meant that any police officer who suspected someone of carrying out a crime could stop them, could search them, could question them, and if necessary, arrest and detain them. And in black communities like Brixton in South London, or Hackney in East London, or other cities such as St Paul's in Bristol, or Toxteth or Liverpool 8 in Liverpool, or Moss Side in Manchester, or Handsworth in Birmingham, we saw massive increases and uses of this sus law to stop, to search, to question, and to apprehend black people in particular. The other kind of powers that we saw were raids on black businesses and black homes. If you've seen the BBC series Small Axe, which I recommend everybody watch, you can see an example of this in the Mangrove restaurant in episode 1 of the series, which constantly is raided by the police. In 1980, you see the first of a series of rebellions against this type of policing, against the raids on people's homes and the sus laws, which led to people being searched, questioned, and arrested. The first rebellion takes place in St Paul's in Bristol, where people challenge the raid of a black-owned cafe called the Black and White Cafe in St Paul's. And then after that, you see it in Nottingham, the Nottingham area, in an area called Radford. In 1981, you see more rebellions against the sus laws in places like Brixton and a number of other areas across England, including Toxteth in Liverpool, Moss Side in Manchester, um, and other cities as well. And it's here, after these rebellions against the sus laws, that you see the next stage of colonial policing being introduced to Britain. This is the colonial policing of collective punishment and collective violence. In this context, you see Britain starting to use forms of colonial policing that had never before been used on the British mainland. I'll give you 2 or 3 examples of this kind of colonial policing. The first is the use of poison gas for the first time on the British mainland. Before that, poison gas had only ever been used in Northern Ireland, one of Britain's oldest colonies, and also in colonies such as Kenya, which we learnt about in the last class, and in other parts of the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. These forms of poison gas include pepper spray and CS spray, which some of you might be familiar with today. But this was used on the British mainland for the first time ever in Toxteth, in Liverpool, and then Moss Side in Manchester. And it was specifically used, it was said, against the black communities there who were rebelling against the sus laws that were being used to stop, to search, to question, to arrest young black people in particular, as well as the raids that were taking place on black businesses, black homes, and black youth and community centres. In 1985, you see for the first time guns being used on the being deployed on the British mainland. It wasn't the kind of guns that you might see today, carried by anti-terror police in major airports or train stations in this country. They were guns with rubber bullets, and they were deployed for the first time in Tottenham in North London in 1985, following a rebellion which took place after somebody's home was raided and their mother died during that home raid. Now, although the rubber bullets weren't actually, no rubber bullets were actually shot in this particular rebellion, it's important to point out, it did mark an important turning point in that they were actually brought to the scene and they were ready to be used. And they marked a distinct change in British policing, where now it became more and more common for British police to be armed, particularly against black communities. And we can see the legacies of that today, and we'll learn about that in later classes when we look at the policing of gangs and the policing of terrorism. One of the other forms of colonial policing that was used was a tactic which had previously been used in both in Northern Ireland, but also in Hong Kong and other colonies as well, which was taking armoured vehicles, so vehicles with effectively armour all over it, so pieces of metal all over it, and driving it into crowds of people with the apparent intention of dispersing them, like making them disperse. This injured quite seriously 2 people in Moss Side, in Manchester, and killed a disabled man in Toxteth in 1981. And this was the first time this tactic had been used on the British mainland. As I said before that, it had only ever been used in Britain's colonies and former colonies. And like the processes of colonial policing, which were not simply far more violent than had been things that had been used in Britain, but also used forms of collective punishment against a suspect community. Race also played a fundamental role in the policing of these black communities. So, as I mentioned before, Britain had identified this suspect community through the media and the media images which portrayed black people as muggers, through political rhetoric from politicians, which said that Britain had a race problem, people like Enoch Powell and others, but also through the rhetoric of police officers themselves, who considered Britain to be having a more serious problem with criminality and violence, since people from Britain's colonies and former colonies in Africa and Asia and the Caribbean had come to Britain in significant numbers. Racism played a really fundamental role in justifying the use of these new forms of colonial policing, which deployed, as I mentioned, surveillance through searches and raids on people's homes, and questioning people on the streets, but also forms of collective punishment and collective violence, mass arrests of people, sending people to prison, the violence of poison gas, and armored vehicles. And again, it's at this point as well that we see the development of riot police. So police with large armored helmets and visors, large shields, larger batons, all of these different types of armor. This is what we might call a militarization of policing. The police in Britain began to look more and more like a military force. And it's this military or this militarization of policing in Britain that takes place in the 1980s, which makes British policing look more and more like colonial policing. And the reason that British policing on the mainland against a domestic population, a home population, can look more and more like colonial policing, the policing of Britain's colonial subjects, is because those colonial subjects have migrated home in significant numbers. They've come from being colonial subjects to being people living and working in the centre of empire. And so therefore the racism that was used to justify the slavery and the colonial exploitation and the colonial violence in the Caribbean and Africa and Asia was now coming home to Britain. And it's those, and while of course the experiences and the policing of Britain's black communities isn't exactly the same as those experiences of Kenya and other parts of the colonies that we learned about last week, we see echoes of empire. We see similar kinds of violence, similar kinds of racist thinking, similar kinds of surveillance, of collective punishment, of violence. And so in order to understand both police racism in Britain, we have to understand where it came from. And it didn't spring up out the ground out of nowhere. And it certainly didn't come about because black people brought it to Britain. The reason that racist policing developed in Britain in the 20th century is because Britain had been developing racist policing for centuries in its colonies. And it now had come to Britain to control and police those communities which it deemed to still be part and connected to the empire. The black communities and the Asian communities, the cities all over the country. I think the final point that I want us to think about is the way in which Britain's cities are still very much multicultural. Black communities don't live separately from other working class communities in Britain. Black communities who are low income or in working class communities live alongside white people. And so when the powers, such as the sus laws to stop and to search and to question people, when the colonial policing of poison gas and armed police began to be used following the urban rebellions of the 1980s, whilst their primary target were the black people living in those areas, white people were living and continue to live alongside those black communities and were also affected by the sus laws being stopped and searched and questioned. Were also affected by the use of poison gas and mass arrest and other forms of police violence and brutality. And while black people are disproportionately affected by this type of violence, so they're more likely to be stopped and searched and arrested. And whilst the use of this kind of policing was justified because it was being targeted at black people, once it had been originally introduced, it started to be used against people from working class communities, from lower income communities of all different ethnic groups. And so it's important for us to think about the ways in which policing and this form of police violence isn't just about race, it's also about class. And thinking about how race and class are connected, I think, is really important in understanding who it is that is adversely affected by forms of police harassment, violence, discrimination, and detention.